that way, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard, yeah.
Relations, you want to?
Yep.
Oh.
Runs it. Still or somewhere.
Right, yeah, oh.
He's got his own Porsche over in Stanwell. Well, hey,
You know, but there's some things about it.
one for the
Yeah,
trail,
yeah.
one for the beach, one for that.
It is what it is.
Yeah.
That have all
Well.
these different cameras. But that don't have
Ruth, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
slugs,
I'm good.
set of high heels.
April kind
Oh.
of came and went. I never.
My husband said today, he goes, do you realize
The
we're almost to
application,
June?
she's got all
I
kinds
thought,
of-
oh,
Right,
It's like
right.
quiet.
I know.
The guys just have
And
different.
it's
I tell you what hit me the other day when David sent a note out.
Yeah,
that says,
yeah.
This is
I'm going
somebody.
to call the May
supposed to have
16th,
14
2013 meeting of the Farragut Municipal Planning Commission to order, please.
grand.
We start out with our citizens forum. Do we have anyone in the audience who has anything they'd like to say that's not related to one of our items on the agenda tonight? Well, I have something that I want to say. Some sad news. Melissa Mustard is retiring. We're going to miss Melissa's input and her insight that she's brought to the Planning Commission, but she's retiring, and we understand that with a busy family, it's hard to get everything in. We appreciate Melissa's time and the commitment that she's given to the town of Farragut. And the mayor, who couldn't be with us tonight, has a appreciation package for you.
Thank you.
And
you all.
so we're all going to miss you,
Oh,
and so
thank you.
thank you
Aw.
for taking your time.
Fun, oh. Thank you. It's been a blast. It's been, yeah, no, there's no
Interesting.
speech. It has
Interesting.
been a learning experience, and I know I've picked the right place to live. It's been 15 years now, but I knew that a long time ago, but thank you all.
Thank you, Melissa. We really do appreciate your time. Approval of the minutes. Do we have any comments, changes, corrections?
I'll move for approval.
Second.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Move on to item number 3, discussion and public hearing on an annual review and approval of the concept plan of Bridgemore subdivision located on McPhee Road between Allen Kirby Road and the roundabout, zoned R-1 OSR.
This is an annual reapproval process that we do for all of our larger subdivisions that have concept plans that haven't been completely built out. Most of you are very familiar with Bridgemore subdivision. As Jerry just pointed out to me, it's probably the most photographed park we have in town or in Knox County, because senior pictures, wedding pictures, prom pictures, everything goes to everybody goes to Bridgemore because the entrance is absolutely beautiful, and we are very proud that it's in the town of Farragut. The purpose of this annual reapproval process is really to keep you all familiarized with the overall plan of the project, and so that when future preliminary plats come before you, you kind of have a remembrance of where it fits into the scheme of things, but also for adjoining property owners' sakes, that they keep in tune with that. Yes, this is coming. It isn't going to be a field forever. The staff does recommend reapproval of the Bridgemore development. As the notes for you state, that there is a total of 431 single-family lots on 326.9 acres, with a total of 115 acres as platted open space. As you know, Unit 1 has been already developed, and that is where we have the absolutely gorgeous entrance into the subdivision. So staff does recommend approval.
Does the applicant wish to say anything?
I'm just thankful for being there. Oh, no,
Wait,
I can say it loud.
No, we can't see you and can't pick you up. At home, it's just a blank space there.
Well, no, I'm just thankful to be in Farragut, glad the market's better, and it's a great time to be, and looking forward to some opening up some other areas pretty soon, and I think it's a great place to be, and I appreciate all that y'all do. And I am going to have to leave because I have to go negotiate a contract right after this, so I'm not being rude. I'd love to stay. Bye.
Do we have any questions for him quickly before he leaves?
Everything looks great, Jerry.
Thanks. All right.
I'd like to offer a motion for approval.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Oppose? Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Item number 4, discussion and public hearing on a site plan for Thornton Professional Building, 10904 Kingston Pike, located on the southwest corner of Kingston Pike and Thornton Drive, Zone C-1, 1.26 acres, JT Development, or TJ Development and Management applicant.
A couple of you may recall a few years ago, this is the part 3 of a series of developments. The first one was Parkview West Assisted Living. The other one is the Thornton Center, where the Genesis Chiropractic practice is located. And then this is the third phase that they actually had originally planned on doing sooner, but because of the turn down of the economy, they have waited, and they are now getting back at it. Before you is the site plan that they are proposing, and as was approved with the original subdivision plat, there is a connection from Thornton Drive to the parking lot of the Thornton Center, so that all of these uses are interconnected, so you do not have to get back out onto Kingston Pike if you are going from one of the spaces to the other space. There is a billboard on the property. Due to contractual obligations, the property owner cannot remove the billboard as part of this project. This building is going to look fairly similar to the Thornton Center that's immediately next door, and there will be 2 to 3, most likely 2 tenant spaces at this in this building. So it will match very well with the developments that are partnered in with this overall development. And at your places is the staff recommendation, and we are recommending approval of the site plan subject to items 1 through 13. Chris, the letter that you got, I combined because some of them had duplicate comments, and of course the last one being meet all town requirements. But we are recommending approval of the site plan subject to items 1 through 13.
Do you have anything you want to say, Chris?
No, ma'am.
Okay. You're all right with all the requirements?
Yes.
Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question, Chris. It appears that you guys are dedicating some additional right-of-way. Is that for the decel lane?
Correct.
Is that kind of what's going on there?
Yes.
It's a real interesting design. I guess, Ruth, is that mostly dictated just because of the angle of Thornton Drive, being that it's less than a 90-degree angle? You're trying to make that decel and that turn radius a little softer? Was that kind of the purpose of that?
No, actually, it is because of this really big utility pole right there. The pole itself isn't so big, but everything on it is really big. And to move that utility pole, you'd have to move all the utility poles down through there because of the angle.
The alignment?
of it.
Okay,
It
makes
was going
sense.
to be really expensive, and we looked at this this.
I liked it. I mean, I think it's great. Plus, you have a little area to. I assume you're going to landscape that island.
Well, there's a sidewalk in a portion of it. I mean, it'll be grassed.
You're talking
We-
about this island?
I'm talking about that. Is that going to be an island, or is that going to be
It's a grassed island.
that'll remain in Okay. No, I like it. I mean, I think it's a
Actually-
little unique, and it definitely it seems like it does help because of the angles being less than 90 degrees, less than perpendicular. Seems like it just makes that.
We met with TDOT in 2009 to look at it preliminarily, and they liked it too. They thought it created kind of a separation between main line and
It does. I mean, it gets the traffic that's slowing down and making a right turn, and gets them off of Kingston Pike.
yeah.
So I think it's kind of interesting design.
Yeah, I think it helps with the conflict if you're turning off Kingston Pike there. It's very,
Mhm.
so they can.
Yeah, I didn't think about that.
You
You're
can
ex-
literally stop. You have a lot more stacking too, right there.
Yeah.
Well, and if you ever did have like a big truck in there, instead of them having to make it that turn real wide, they're going to have kind of their own lane to get out of the way, which is kind of nice. Where are the bike racks? I'm having a little hard time with my.
At the yeah, there you go.
Reading it.
Ruth circled it there.
Okay.
Yeah, the bike racks per our ordinance are to be near entrances, and they chose to place them at the rear entrances of the building.
That's one. It's a logical placement. I just couldn't find it.
Does anybody else have any more questions or comments? Do I have a motion?
Move to approve, subject to the stipulations.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Item number 5, discussion for a request for abandonment of right-of-way, Old Snyder Road, right-of-way at North Campbell Station Road, located between parcels 122 and 123.02, tax map 130, Farragut Municipal Code, Title 16, Chapter 3, Road Closing or Terminating Policy. Eddie Karani, Marathon Gas Station applicant.
This request before you is required per the Farragut Municipal Code that anytime there is a road closure or abandonment, it must first go before the Planning Commission for a recommendation. This is the site of the old Snyder Road, and the next aerial photograph, I guess what I'll do so that shows up better on the next aerial photograph kind of zooms in. This area has already been closed, and here are some pictures just showing the closure of that area. That the road is now aligned to the north there in front of where the Fairfield Inn and Suites is being located, is being constructed. And there is we have the diamonds up for the road closure, and then this is the view from Campbell Station Road. And so the request before the Planning Commission is whether to abandon this right-of-way and give it to the adjacent property owners. In your packets, because we don't deal with this very often, the most recent one that we dealt with was the Buddy Gregg request for the abandonment of that old Heron Road. And that Heron Road was abandoned years ago when the interstate was actually built, and it bisected Heron Road. The one prior to that we did was dealing with the Heron Road on the south side of the interstate, the area where Gander Mountain is, and then where J.C. Penney is. And the issue before us tonight is whether, we want to abandon this right-of-way, not just have it closed for the time being, or having it closed, but to abandon the right-of-way where we would give it to the adjoining property owners. At this time, we feel that the request is premature. If you can see from this aerial photograph, the road is located to the north. As most of you are aware, ultimately the long-term goal is to when the interchange is redesigned, that the interchange will actually be moving to the west, and it will be on the other side of the Comfort Suites and the Country Inn and Suites. Can't remember. Yeah. And so that area through there, we have a lot of unknown factors that are before us, and so we don't know. It's not to say that someday we won't feel that it is a good idea to abandon this right-of-way. We just feel like that since the road was just recently realigned, it was completed in December of 2012, that the request is premature and we aren't ready to make a decision as to what the future of this is.
Is the applicant, someone representing the applicant, or the applicant here?
Apparently not.
Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Yeah, make it clear to me what the actual right-of-way is. I'm not.
This is the right-of-way, and this is those pictures that I just showed you
Okay.
with the closure. Is like right in this area right here. And so
Yeah,
what
and
they're
that-
requesting, and in reality, we left a very a large driveway. If you have been out there at all,
Yeah.
it's really kind of a very large area that in reality you could, close this much of it and just have this be the access through here. We just feel that not knowing, what lies in store for us in the future in this area, exactly, because even though our long-term plans obviously are to have the interstate interchange move to the west, the aerial photograph doesn't quite get there, but it's right about at the corner of your screen here, and then be located on the west side here. If you two of you might recall, but the rest of you, three of you might recall, when this site plan came in, the idea was that there will be a shared access possibly for these two hotels in this location onto that area. And it's not saying that these won't be there anymore, it's just that the future of what this road will be someday, we're not really certain at this point in time. Oftentimes with right-of-ways that are, streets that are closed, we sometimes maintain those because we want future pedestrian connections. That may be something at this location, but we don't know how things are going to be changing in the future in that respect. So we just feel that the request at this time is premature.
Has that new interchange been completely designed yet? Or
No, it has not. Right-of-way has been dedicated over the years with different subdivisions that have occurred. And so whenever you have right-of-way for an interchange, that kind of already there, just waiting, that does tend to kind of have a impact on the ultimate design. But the interchange isn't designed. When I was a transportation planner for the MPO, TPO down at the Metropolitan Planning Commission, we were telling everybody that every interchange in West Knox County was going to be reconstructed by the year 2000. Well, I've been here 19 years, and when I came here, I told people that it was going to be done in 5 to 15 years, and 19 years later, I'm still saying 5 to 15 years. So obviously, it's a matter of money.
sometime this century, huh?
Well, I'm not even going to say that, but I'm still going to say 5 to 15 years because that just keeps moving it out there. It is on a priority list, but again, obviously finances plays a part in every kind of capital project that you do, and that's why when you have right-of-way acquired already, that does play an impact on the design.
I noticed the letter in a package talked about the property owner to the north had declined an option on it, or his interest in it, or?
We actually wanted to do and discussed a land swap, but the land swap was kind of involving, because this right-of-way is very erratic, and this right-of-way through here is very erratic. So what we were looking at was with the additional right-of-way we needed to acquire through here, there's actually a right-of-way here, and what we were looking at was doing a land swap to even up the right-of-way over here with this to make an equal number of square footage so that we could get a land swap, and they were not interested in it, so. I wasn't involved in that, so hopefully I recapped that correctly. I could be wrong in that, but that was my understanding.
Philosophically, I think I would be opposed to giving away the taxpayers' assets without consideration. Whether that it be a land swap or that be a financial consideration, my thought of just giving away property that we would otherwise have to acquire and purchase if we were trying to get the right of way, I think in the best interest of the taxpayer, it makes sense that if we were ever to convey this property to an adjacent property owner, I think it should go through a process that would determine its fair market value, and then if they want to entertain the purchase of it, if we wanted to retain an easement, that would factor into the fair market value, i.e. the easement would be like for a pedestrian access or something like that in the future.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, I mean, that property to the north could change ownership too, and the whole, idea of how that develops could change. We don't have an integrated plan yet till we know what that interchange is gonna do, so I think I tend to agree with the staff about it being premature.
I think so too.
I agree that nothing should be done without some compensation. In this case, the gentleman looks like he'd kind of like that piece of property for free, but that's
I think that the letter was pretty black and white.
Yeah.
If he could get it for free, he'd accept it. If he had to pay for it, he didn't want it.
Yep.
but well, that alone is enough to.
What
Right.
kind of,
But
it's not acreage, but what kind of,
Square footage?
yeah,
We didn't even calculate it.
but we're not talking a
Well,
very large.
Is it 50 feet, probably 50-foot right away?
No, it actually is a little bit more than 50 feet. It's very erratic it's not a consistent right-of-way width through there, and it does, I think the narrowest point to 60 feet.
Well, I'm sure that if we had to acquire that right away, we'd pay dearly for it.
We did just to the north.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Been there, done that.
This is for discussion purposes only tonight. Does anybody else have any other questions? If not, we'll move on. Item number 6, discussion and public hearing on an amendment to the Farragut zoning ordinance, Chapter 4, Section 8, Farragut Municipal Flood Damage Prevention Regulations to adopt the latest flood study of Turkey Creek and North Fork Turkey Creek and to update regulations accordingly.
Yes, you've heard us talk about this flood study for quite some time now, that we were going through the process of the public comment period through FEMA with their consultant, and there were not every creek in Farragut was restudied. We only have 3, but 2 of the 3 were, and throughout Tennessee, the creeks, rivers, streams, whatever you want to define them as, that were chosen to be restudied were the ones that had experienced high growth from their previous time that they were studied. And in our case, Turkey Creek and North Fork Turkey Creek did make the list for restudying. City of Knoxville and Knox County, it was kind of the same way. They had several of their streams, rivers, creeks restudied also. And part of the process, if you remember, after we had the flood 2 years ago in February, we even brought it up during a citizens forum about the fact that we had met with the consultant in January, and he had told us that the base flood elevation had risen from 2 to 4 feet, and we were just incredulous that it could raise like that. And then we had that flood in February, and it was like, yep, it did. And so, in essence, what we have before us is the backup information explaining, the National Flood Insurance Program. And there are 3 components of the National Flood Insurance Program. It's the flood insurance, the floodplain management, and the flood hazard mapping. Now, for the residents of this town that have homes that are located within floodplains, and for businesses that are located within floodplains, the flood insurance is a really big part of the program. In order for any entity to get flood insurance, Farragut has to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and we do get audited. They come up, they check our records they do make sure that we have gotten certificates of elevation, that there hasn't been any monkeying around in the floodways and flood fringes that haven't been authorized, or studies haven't been done, and that sort of thing. And in fact, Farragut was actually kicked out of the flood insurance program back in 1988 because of work that had been done illegally in the floodplain. And getting back in is very tough. I mean, you have to jump through a lot of hoops. In 1988, it wasn't as big a deal because we didn't have any flood insurance policies in the town of Farragut at that point in time. We have a lot at this point in time, so we have to stay in the program, because if we are kicked out of the program, their mortgages come due immediately. Their mortgages are called. And so it's a very serious responsibility on the part of the town to take the floodplain management, because that's what we have to do, end of it, very seriously. The town of Farragut historically always regulated 1 foot above the base flood elevation of the 500-year flood. I know that's like speaking Greek, but the base flood elevation really is the anticipated level of the flood based on some nice little computer modeling thing. Farragut always chose to regulate to 1 foot above the 500-year flood. The Federal Emergency Management Agency requires a base minimum of 1 foot above the 100-year flood. And we went a little higher just because that's just the 100-year flood, and if you've ever experienced a flood, it doesn't matter whether you have insurance, it's really a hassle to deal with being flooded and everything. And it's also about paying the flood insurance and that sort of thing. And so when we had the most recent mapping that we adopted in 2007, and that actually was mapped in 1999, it just took 8 years to get it adopted because of appeals through the process. We opted, since they no longer were measuring or calculating the base flood elevation of the 500-year flood, but only the 100-year flood, we opted to have our minimum floor elevation at 3 feet above the base flood elevation. And that is because by rule of thumb, it's obvious the 500-year is 2 feet above the 100-year. So we basically stayed with the regulations that we had in place at that point in time, except we went 3 feet above the 100 because those were the only base flood elevations information that we had with that mapping. Part of the reason that they stopped mapping to the 500 was just the pure expense of it all. These studies are extremely expensive to do, and they were trying to update a lot of jurisdictions' maps across the country, and so they just across the board decided to go with the 100-year, and then gave out the because we aren't the only ones that were regulating to the 500, so they kind of gave out that rule of thumb. Now, whether that is 100% accurate, it's don't know, but that's with their calculations, that was a general rule of thumb. The ordinance before you tonight, we are required to always update whenever we have new flood studies done to keep our text in line with what we currently have. I actually was going to highlight the differences, but this is an extremely long ordinance, and also it's extremely hard to compare because they shifted things around. Because we do regulate some things differently, it was kind of hard to compare. And I did point out, for example, under the definition of development, that they took out the term permanent storage because they don't want any storage in the flood where you can create a situation where stuff is going downstream and block bridges. I wish I was able to access the pictures that I had taken of a river in Murphy, North Carolina, where they had a tornado last fall, and of course that created a lot of debris on the slopes, on the mountain slopes near the town. And then they had torrential rains a few months ago, and all that debris went down slope into the river. And when it got to the bridge going to the high school, it only takes one. It hit it this way, and there was a debris pile that was unbelievable, and there was no longer a road on the side of the bridge. The bridge withstood it, but the water had to go somewhere, and it took out the road next to it. So that's why they don't want any storage in the, where it's going to float downstream kind of thing. You're all very familiar with the flood that Nashville experienced a few years ago. Nashville has a base flood elevation of 4 feet, a minimum floor elevation of 4 feet above their base flood elevation. And ours is 3 feet, and we are actually recommending, that is the most significant change between these two ordinances. We are actually recommending that we go from a 3 feet to a 4 feet above the base flood elevation. Now that is purely optional on your all's part. But our rationale for this is that the Biggert Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012 basically eliminated all subsidies for flood insurance. They will be phased out. And where this is significant is when we had the previous study, and then when we adopted the 2007 studies, we had a lot of properties that were not designated in the floodplain that were then designated into 2007. And as a result, people were having to buy insurance. Well, the way it was before is that if you had built your house compliant and there was no problems, later studies showed that you were in a floodplain, your insurance was subsidized. The government can't continue to do that with the natural disasters that we've had. And flooding is the most costly natural disaster in the state of Tennessee, but is also the most preventable natural disaster. You can't predict a tornado, you can't predict a lot, hailstorms and those kinds of things, but flooding, you know where it's going to flood. I mean, we all know where it's going to flood. And so raising the base flood elevation by 1 foot, what that really does is just add an extra level of insurance for properties that are being developed in the floodplain. I pointed out to you in the past, when we talked about that, about the Pinnacle Bank there at the corner of Brooklawn and South Campbell Station Road, that they were constructed 3 feet above the base flood elevation. But when we had that flood in February of 2011, the water was in their parking lot lapping at their doors. So one of the things that we are seeing a difference in also, and this is a big debate at FEMA with how they do their calculations, and I think Daryl describes it best, is that we are seeing more of the tropical storm type event rather than the 100-year, which is the 1%, or the 500-year storm or whatever. And what we're seeing is large amounts of rain in short periods of time. And so that is difficult to calculate and to model when you have these types of storms. And so for that reason, the staff is recommending to increase the freeboard front, which is what you call that safety measure. The minimum, of course, is 1 foot, and we are recommending to increase from 3 feet to 4 feet. It's kind of one of those things where you can look at the cost of adding an extra layer or two of block and elevating a commercial structure or a house compared to the cost of long-term flood insurance over the years, or even from recovery from a flood. So that is the staff recommendation. I include it in your packets, just a copy of what the flood maps look like. These are adopted by reference in the ordinance. And then also the legend. And then these are pictures from that flood on February 28th, 2011. This is at the corner of Brooklawn and Campbell Station Road. This is nowhere near the floodplain. This is the building on the right over here. That used to be the Montessori school, but it's the offices. Right over here is where Krispy Kreme is over here.
It's the floodplain, just not the floodway.
Correct.
Okay.
Actually, I don't think the
How
flood.
much property is in our floodplain?
I do not know the square footage or acreage or miles or whatever, but when you look at the zoning, I mean, basically it's Little Turkey Creek, and North Fork, Turkey Creek along through there. And this map, gives you an idea. That's North Fork, Turkey Creek, running into Turkey Creek. So that kind of gives you an idea of, the land area that's involved in that. And then
South Fork has some, what's the other fork that runs through the Willow Creek Golf Course?
that's Little Turkey Creek.
Little Turkey Creek. I mean, that's quite a bit of floodplain going all the way over into, even all the way up to Andover, isn't it?
Yes, and that's where the difference was in the 2007 study, is that it used to just go up to Fox Run, and then with the 2007 study, it went all the way to the far reaches of Andover. So a lot of those houses in Andover, and there's actually a parcel on Everett Road that is completely within the floodway, not just within the flood fringe. It's owned by the owner is the same as the adjoining property owner, but this gives you an example of how close water can get to houses, and it can be kind of scary when you're
This is across from Village Green at Shiloh.
This is Shiloh subdivision. But this is an example of, this storm didn't fall under the category of a 100-year storm or a 500-year storm or anything, and it's just that it was a very quick rain, and if you remember, there was a lot of flooding and a lot of damage in North Knoxville, and it seemed to be quite localized, and part of it just happened to be localized over Farragut. But the idea is that the goal would be to protect property and to regulate the floodplain development. Now, one of the things that we did maintain with changing this is that we currently have a 50% no fill line in the floodplain. So halfway between the 500-year line mark, which is indicated on the maps, and it just doesn't have an elevation for it, and the floodway, you can only fill 50% of it. There was actually a study a few years ago done, I think AMEC did the study if I remember correctly, and they found that if they filled up the entire flood fringe of Beaver Creek, it would raise the base flood elevation like some ungodly number. And realizing that it probably wasn't feasible to say you can't fill up any of the floodplain, they went with a compromise of 50%. And so when we adopted the maps in 2007, when I say we, I mean the city of Knoxville, Knox County, and Farragut all had to adopt the maps by a certain date. In fact, our drop dead date on this one is August 2nd, I think, or August 5th. And all three jurisdictions went with the 50% no-fill line, and we're staying with that with this ordinance.
Is this the new map? Is this the
Yes,
most
this is
current?
a copy of the new map.
Okay.
Now, Ruth, go over again what this means for the individual homeowner.
Basically, what it does is keep us current with the flood regulations, and whenever we are dealing with development and developers in the floodplain, these will be the regulations that we follow, and that's part of the second component of the NFIP is with the floodplain management. The flood hazard mapping is exactly what you're looking at on the screen. I actually have all here's the cross-section studies and the maps and everything in here, and we also have CDs and everything. So they have cross-section. That's what these, each one of these maps. Like this is what a map looks like. I just made a small corner of it for you all to see. But then these maps correspond with this detailed flood study information, and you have cross sections and flood data and everything, and this is what is part of the study that is done with that. So basically, what this does is keep the town compliant with the flood regulations, and by being compliant with flood regulations, how it impacts the individual property owners is that they can maintain their flood insurance.
So if they were compliant with before, but they're non-compliant after this change,
Well, basically,
they're still eligible for a flood.
right. These maps are dated August 5th, 2013, and for us to remain compliant with the NFIP program, we have to have these maps adopted by the Planning Commission and the Board of Mayor and Aldermen prior to August 15th, August 5th, and I have to send all the certifications and everything in to FEMA. And they proof our ordinance to make sure that we are compliant with everything. And as long as we are, then we are in good graces, and we continue in the program. And like I said, they do come and audit us and check our records to make sure that, for example, if you read the ordinance carefully, which I'm sure is a real stimulating one if you got, one of the requirements is that even though we keep everything by property file in our record keeping process, we have to keep a separate floodplain development file where we keep all copies of all certificates of elevation and various documentation that goes with anything that's flood related has to be kept in this file. And we have a separate file so like if someone is doing construction in the floodplain, like Discount Tire, for example, is now under construction in the floodplain, they have to do the preliminary certificate of elevation, which is showing that, okay, it's looking good so far, but then at the end of their project, they have to do a final certificate of elevation, which shows that all their HVAC units and everything like that are also elevated, including their base floor elevation is elevated above the minimum floor elevation. And so we put a copy in their property file, but then we also put a copy in the FEMA file. For example, when we were dealing with the Kroger complex, when that was under construction, somebody started building and they didn't get their surveyor out, and they chipped out a lot of concrete and poured a little bit extra in the next go around because they didn't meet the base flood minimum floor elevation. So, it's.
Any more questions or comments? I think the objectives here are something that we all certainly agree with, that to protect human life and health and safety and property. But one thing that jumped out at me was the fact that to minimize prolonged business interruptions, that was something that Nashville really got hit with when they had their flood.
We met with a consultant the other day on a different project that is from the Franklin area, and he was talking about the Nashville floods at that time when he was there, and how, I mean, being an engineering consultant, you know, he was heavily impacted peripherally from the standpoint of nobody could do anything. You know, that everything was shut down, and he was talking about where his residence was, that he felt like he was an island because his house was elevated, but everybody around him was underwater. And he said that was a very freaky kind of feeling.
Any more questions and comments? Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve resolution PC 1305.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Noah,
Opposed?
did you second that? Or who seconded?
I think Ed.
Oh, Ed did, okay. You want me to flip it over, Gary?
Please.
Item number 7 is discussion of request to amend the 2012 Comprehensive Land Use Plan Update, parcel 109, tax map 130, located on the east side of North Campbell Station Road, north of the Holiday Inn Express, 30.5 acres from the open space clustered residential to mixed use. Kim Wellens, applicant.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Good evening, Gary Palmer, the Assistant Town Administrator for the Town of Farragut. I think we left this at the last meeting that we were going to go back and delve a little deeper into some of the implications for a land use change for this property. Right now, the current zoning is R2. I'll just do a little recap. Current zoning is R2. The category for the future land use map is, I believe, open space cluster residential. And Mr. and Mrs. Wellens, the applicants, want to pursue some other land use on that property. Ideally for them, I think it would be commercial. And I told Ms. Wellens I just want to kind of recap, and then she could come up and talk to the commission. But anyway, and we met on this several times before our last meeting, and we left it with you all that we were going to go back and look at it. I think some people expressed interest about taking a look at the property themselves physically. I don't know if that happened or not, but we did go back, myself, Ruth, Community Development Director, Mark Shipley, the Assistant Community Development Director, the Town Engineer, Assistant Town Engineer. And we all sat down and really dug into this and talked this out, kind of like we did when we did some of the areas of the comprehensive land use plan. We also looked at what the implication of a change would do to the surrounding area, the property, and the town of Farragut. So there were kind of several questions we wanted to ask ourselves in doing this. One is what's the best, highest use for this property? 2, what's the best result for the town of Farragut as a whole? And 3, of course, what's in the best interest of the owner and the surrounding properties? I'll try to flip over to, let me see. I think the main implication or the main issue with this property is obviously the topography. You can see that there are several areas that are environmentally sensitive. You can look at the annotation on the map and see that terrain has some pretty steep slopes. It also has some flat area in the front. So we looked at that, and I think Daryl brought up the comment with enough money you can really do anything, but getting back into that property and regrading, putting a large development in that area, outside of disturbing the environmentally sensitive areas, I think it would probably be extremely expensive and probably not worth pursuing. However, that's a little bit out of our realm. So we looked at more of the topography, the surrounding uses, and if you want to, I handed out an email I sent the other day to Mr. and Mrs. Wellens, just kind of going over what we talked about. We determined that the best use for this property would be a medium to low density residential on the front with some passive recreation amenities towards the back, basically leaving the back almost untouched. We met with Mr. and Mrs. Wellens about it, talked about it, went over this recommendation, and we're not saying that the commercial would be, or another use would be wrong. I think this area outside of the town of Farragut, it would work. But, you know, when we're looking at this, we're also looking at the other commercial areas, the commercial cores in the town. Hard to ignore all the empty storefronts in some of the areas along Kingston Pike that are vacant. And if you remember back when we went through the comprehensive land use plan process with the consultants, we talked about the cannibalization of our commercial from going from one area to another. So, you know, we have to ask ourselves that question. Is this going to cause a problem or continue to cause a problem with the commercial that's already being cannibalized? And I think we collectively, as a staff, agreed that you know, we're kind of commercialed out right now. And that's when we talked a little bit more about how we would do the density on the property more towards the front. And really that was about it. We didn't really come up to, other than us deciding on the best use of the property being medium low density residential. We really didn't come up with any other conclusions for this property. I don't know if you have any questions of me right now. I mean, I'll be right here if you do, but Ms. Wellens may want to talk a little bit about her ideas and what she sees for this property.
I'd like to clarify something about with the way our land use plan is written, that when Gary's talking about the medium to low density residential, keep in mind that that's a term that's used in our plan because in comparison to other jurisdiction, that in Farragut terms, that's actually Lanesboro apartments. To give you an idea of what we were looking at is that you would have that it would be a good transition from you have a hotel, another hotel, apartment type style development at the front end where it's compatible for that type of development, and then you're out in the county, but that is where the Farragut mobile home park is, which if you've ever been in there, it's actually a very nice mobile home park because they have built it into the existing terrain and everything. So I just wanted to clarify that because you may not remember that from when Jeff made that presentation at the Planning Commission meeting with regards to density. So,
Good evening. I am Kay Wellens. This is my sister Carla Hodges this evening, and we do appreciate so much the time you all have put into this already. I know we were very appreciative of the fact that you met with us earlier this week to talk about the property. We kind of agree, as Mr. Palmer says, we know, and Ms. Hawk so eloquently said the other day, we do know that there are challenges on the back of the property, especially with topography. And we talked about the need to preserve some of the area in the back for sure, to be really nature friendly. Of course, we know that the most recent buyers looking at the property have been the multifamily dwelling units. Of course, our dream would be that someone would come in with just copious amounts of dirt to fill in what we think are those low places or sinkholes. But in any event, we certainly understand what the town is saying, that for your benefit as well as ours, it makes the most sense for the multifamily dwellings to be on the majority of the property. However, we still have this dream of that frontage there on the road being used for something commercial that would be appealing to the dwellers in the multifamily complex, as well as to some other Farragut residents. I said I personally would dream of a shoe store, and that would be Shoes of Comfort. But anyway, we again realize we don't want the town saturated with businesses that are not doing well, for sure. But as we have been, involved in this property our whole lives, we just really feel there might be something compatible to the front of the property there that would not only lend itself to the location, but really end up to be something, perhaps something much more worthwhile than a shoe store, that would appeal to the residents of Farragut.
Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Sure, if you would show them.
Could somebody make it clear to me what the area that you're talking about is possible?
That's where just
Commercial.
saying, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you can see my cursor on the screen, this area right here is fairly flat. Well, it's compared to the rest of the property, it's fairly flat. This is the area that we had the idea of having the multifamily. Let me get that box out. This whole area right here. And then this would be the passive recreation as an amenity for that multiple family. I think the Wellens would like to have that same property be commercially zoned, and the back, I suppose, would remain R2 as it is now, so that wouldn't change.
And the other.
What's the relationship to the road?
Well, Campbell Station, they have some frontage on Campbell Station Road right here. That's Campbell Station. Here, I'll flip it over to the. Let me turn some of this off.
Oh, that helps.
The diagram that was on the screen right before that indicated certain percentages of slopes, and basically that was just to give you an idea of the various areas of slope, and you can tell by the way the topo lines that it drains a fairly significant area down to that stream with that. But to give you an idea of, with the range of those slopes, that our maximum road slopes are 10 to 14%, and those slopes are 20 to 30% slopes. And that's what Gary was talking about with what Daryl said, that you couldn't physically build a road down through there to access it because of such the steepness. And that's where you get into what Ms. Wellens was talking about. You'd have to have a lot of fill dirt to fill that out. It's been quite a few years since I've walked up that stream up through there, but I have walked it. And there is a possibility that there are wetlands, but if someone told me I was wrong, that I would say, okay, then I'm remembering the wrong part of along the stream through there. But when you do look at the topography of it, that is a real possibility given the drainage of the system throughout that area. And that's where the staff is concerned about these environmental areas. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that blue line, if you follow that nice little blue line, which is a stream, it disappears off to the right. And the reason it disappears is because it drains into sinkholes, and that's part of all that sinkhole system through there. In fact, I was out that way the other day, and I took a bunch of pictures along through the new Snyder Road showing the sinkhole not being able to handle that drainage, that it was sitting full and it's going to slowly sink in. So it's a very delicate system out there, and that is part of our staff concern with that.
They also own this property right here, which is in Knox County. That's part of their farm.
So basically, Gary, everything that's cleared there is,
That would be, I would imagine, probably on that tree line would be where you guys were thinking.
Tree
They
line's
had-
probably the natural break for the topography, isn't it? I mean, that's,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
And there's probably about 460 feet of frontage right there on Campbell Station Road.
What's the zone here?
R2.
No, I'm talking about that piece for the Knox County right there. So if we kind of looked at,
Use the trailer park, yeah.
Agricultural.
agriculture.
And this, I don't know what RB is, but
It's a residential, but it's like a rural but it's like a, it's not planned residential, but give me a few minutes, I'll remember. It's,
We do realize, of course, that it's very interesting to be zoned like that 2 different ways, but of course our parents and grandparents before us had every intention of it staying farmland, of course, when they first acquired it. And we really are in no hurry. As my husband said last month, and as Carla and my sister Karen and I know, you know, this R2, the residential, certainly makes the most sense. From meeting with all the planning commission, we certainly agree on that. At the same time, we just know, of course, there's still that road frontage. We are in no hurry. I did tell this story too. My husband's a Cracker Barrel manager. He's there this evening. But he had a customer that said, "Do you know what I heard the other day? There's going to be a Home Depot right up there." So it's been about a year ago, and he said, "Right where?" So the customer kept saying, "Right there where that long driveway is." And David said, I kept thinking, my wife and her sisters own that now, and we've heard nothing about a Home Depot. But it's just certainly for sure that rumors can just abound sometimes. But anyway, as my husband does love to tinker around, he said, "By golly, that would be a great place for a Home Depot," I'm thinking. But anyway, of course, we know that road frontage there is not that great for sure. But it may be just the time of evening and the temperature's going up. I'm thinking, could there be a quaint little ice cream shop there someday? But again, we are open to what you all say for sure meets the needs of this community. And as my husband said last month, David and I have lived here, and we intend to continue living here until we go to an old folks home. And my sister Carla lives off Level Road. It's only one of our sisters, Karen, in Chattanooga. But we are very, very vested in this community and truly want what is best for everyone.
Any more questions or comments? This, again, is only for discussion purposes tonight. Gary, do you have any closing?
I don't envy you. It's a tough one. I would ask you guys digest this and I suppose come back in June and decide.
before you change the screen there, Gary, I was talking about the realignment of Campbell Station Road earlier with the other comment. That map actually shows it. Should have
Yeah, the right of way.
Yeah,
Right here?
yeah, that is where it is anticipated that will be where Campbell Station Road is realigned to at some point in time with the interchange. So that map is much better at illustrating what I was trying to illustrate earlier with the road closure issue. But that does impact, that is a factor also in this discussion before us too.
The last thing I will say, because my husband will ask me this evening, he made the point, he said, we do have hotels there. So if there were something appealing to people that maybe are passing through again, some sort of business on those front 3 acres, say, that really would not mean eventually the doors close, but with some real thought to it, would appeal to those travelers to come across and spend their money there. And that's the first question he'll ask me. Did you mention my motels or hotels? So I can say, yes, I did mention it. Again, thank you so very much for listening to me this
Can I
evening.
ask you one
Sure.
additional question? Going back to that piece that's agriculture, in
Yes, sir.
Knox County. Sure. You all own that as well?
Yes, sir. What happened is our paternal grandfather bought that little piece there, and he just never moved forward to do anything with the zoning, and then he became old and, of course, died. And my parents, for whatever reason, just never also moved forward with rezoning it in any way.
Are you talking or thinking about talking to Knox County about doing something to change that agriculture zone?
Well, I consider myself pretty much a one-dimensional person as far as I throw my heart and soul into my job up here. So I look for experts in the field to tell us, what they think should really happen. And of course, we talk with my spouse and my Sister Karen, our spouses helped us, but we really don't know how to move forward with that. So I'm open to some help.
Okay.
Gary, let me ask,
Thank you.
what is the benefit or the drawback of us keeping it the way it is, or vice versa with changing it, as far as they're concerned?
Well, it's same. I'll go back to some of the points that I talked about earlier and what's on that sheet. It's the drawback to going to commercial would be a couple things. We talked a little bit about the cannibalization of the other commercial in the town, the oversaturation. I know we early on, I think it's on the application, we talked about doing a mixed use, which also would be not advised for this property just because of the comprehensive land use plan stuff that we just put in there. It's and I said it early on, it's a great location for commercial. It's got great access to the interstate. It's surrounded by commercial. It's compatible. It's a tough question. We just collectively agreed that the best use for this property would be a clustering residential. This is, if you look at your, if you look at your land use plan, and I think this is what we're talking about, some medium density, low density residential. You can see the areas that are designated as that, right, and it's right next to it. And they're unfortunately were designated as the lowest of intensity of a use. And we didn't have a chance to really capture this before we approved the plan and had this discussion then. Probably in a more deeper manner, especially with the consultants being here. But it's, like I said, we're not saying commercial is a bad use. We're just saying it's not the best use of that property.
One of the things that we talked to the Wellens about the other day was that right now the open space cluster districts only are overlay for the R1 districts. And those of you that were on the commission when we wrote those districts, we specifically wrote them so that they could be modified to apply to other zoning districts. And this property is zoned R2, and that what would be appropriate for us to pursue or modify is to now change the OS, to allow the OSR and the OSMR, do some modifications to the districts to apply to not only the R1 but to also the R2 district and possibly even the R3 district. If you remember from the land use plan, because it's not just about this particular property, but all the properties that are designated as open space cluster on the land use plan, the primary reason for these areas being designated as that and why we came up with those zoning districts to begin with is because of the environmental constraints on portions of the property. In the southwest sector, we have a lot of sinkholes. If you remember, Bridgemore was one of the first subdivisions with the open space cluster concept because of all the sinkholes that was on the Bridgemore subdivision property or the McPhee farm. And so the idea is that you get it's truly a density bonus for the developers but you are protecting the environmentally sensitive areas. And so when we wrote the zoning district, we really wanted to see how it worked before we thought about tailoring it to some other base zoning districts. And that's what we talked about with the Wellens, that since their property is zoned R2, and I have dealt with several different department folks that have looked at that property, that there's a certain base number of units that would be appropriate for it to be cost effective and everything, that that it would be kind of one of those things to look into now that it's time, that we've now seen that the open space cluster zoning districts really do work. They accomplish what we wanted them to accomplish, and that they are protecting environmentally sensitive areas, and kind of go from there with that process in our next year's work program.
I mean, one of the things I think that may, if it were commercial, that may work against them would be just access to the back part of the property. I mean, the front, you may be able to develop and put some commercial in there, but it basically leaves the rest of your property useless.
Well, that gets to the point. One of the things that when I see this piece of property with certainly the topography in the back and the location on that front footage is, what strikes me is something like a concept of perhaps some commercial on that very front peak, that little flag piece perhaps, that transitions to the residential that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But then from that, when you start getting into that topography, one of the things that they might want to explore is that could be might have some benefits from a financial standpoint too, from taxes and what have you. I'm not advising anything, but it might be worth talking about land conservancy.
Yeah. And we talked, when I originally met with Mr. and Mrs. Wellens, we talked about.
So it's kind of a amalgamation of those ideas, and I don't think that would destroy kind of transition and it would deal with the topography and might have some advantages to them as a family too. So I would suggest that maybe y'all explore that. Maybe y'all talk to some professionals like Foothills Land Conservancy. Some people do that.
I'm wondering how that would play out with regard to the plan and, this process. I mean, it's.
Well, for the amount we're talking about there, I don't think it destroys something. I'm just throwing out
Yeah.
ideas for thinking and discussion. That
Yeah, and that's
it doesn't
what
have
I
to be an
wanna-
all
I
or
wanna
nothing.
get to
That there
that.
are other dimensions that may be used to them as well, because I know that.
Ruth, is it the 15% slopes that really start triggering some issues in our subdivision regulations?
Basically, our maximum slope of road is 14%. So we have yes, 15%.
Seems like I remember 15%, like with the farm at Willow Creek, I remember that when they got into some of those 15% slopes, they ended up including that in open space.
Open space.
And it seems like I just remember 15% being a threshold. I guess kind of what my thought is, kind of going along with what Ed was saying, is that to me, I think the front, we're thinking maybe it's 3 or 4 acres. We'll call it the area that's the pasture, not the wooded land, is completely appropriate for commercial or higher density multifamily. I think that if they wanted to develop the rear of the property, they're more than welcome to develop it. I think our subdivision regulations are going to kick in protecting those slopes. And so I guess what my thought is, instead of trying to get all wound up about the slopes, we already have that protection in the subdivision regulations that has a lot of protection over with 15% slopes. And
Well,
jump in.
It does not specify 15% slopes. It says steep slopes. It has been a matter of practice because we established the maximum slope for roads is when we had looked at it in the land use plan back in 2000 and everything, that we went with the 15% slopes. The issue with the commercial versus the more intense residential is that it goes back to what Gary was saying. Then you can't count that area toward your density or whatever, and then you have the back portion that is inaccessible. And when you look at the idea of people stopping there at the commercial, look at what's already in the vicinity that's zoned commercial, and so the opportunity is already there for the commercial shops for, you know,
Almost 9 acres there, okay.
you know, it's, I'm not sure if I'm verbalizing very well what I'm trying to explain, but you can't rely on the subdivision regulations from the standpoint of, it just says, in fact, like.
Steep,
Yeah, it
instead,
just says
we
steep.
would never really define, maybe that's something we need to do at some point,
And-
is to
Well,
kind of
that's
define
one of
those
the-
steep
That's one of the
slopes.
problems with that's one of the reasons that we came up with the open space cluster districts, because if you say, you know, 15% slope is where it starts and stops, well, there's other factors that come into play. Do you have mature vegetation on there? Are there sinkholes near there? Is it,
Mhm.
you know, does it kind of go flat and then you just drop down, or is it, you know, an extended slope? So there's a lot of things that come into play that when you're dealing with that, all it really says in the subdivision regulations, if I can find it real quick, is you're supposed to avoid it, but now that I'm looking for it, I probably won't be able to find it, but let me go over through real quick.
Gary, just to give people something to kind of get their mind around, you know, you did that neat outline there, you know, came up, as Noah said, just shy of 9 acres. What would be a comparable sized piece of property in town that the board could, you know, just visualize how big that is?
Something around 9 acres.
Yeah.
Can you give me a second, I'll see if I can find something.
You're talking about that whole area though, not just that little flag piece.
The clearing, the clear area was, including the portion in Knox County.
It came up to like 8.9 acres, something nearly 9. I'm trying to think of something that would be,
Are there sinkholes in that area?
it doesn't look like there's any
Yeah,
sinkholes.
not up in here.
Not up on top.
You see a lot of closed contours down here. That's where the creek runs.
9 acres is definitely large enough for a big box. I mean, but Costco, how many acres was Costco?
26?
26 acres?
More like that church.
And so, I mean, you could, but I mean, Costco is an extreme. That's about as big as they get in big boxes. So, I mean, it would allow higher intensity commercial use, and you know whether or not somebody wants to locate there. But when I look at the merits of the property, especially the area that is pasture, and I look at access, road access, I look at topography, utility access. To me, the merits of the property justify a portion of that property to be commercial or higher density residential if they want to do multifamily. Obviously, there are some considerable constraints on the property that has to do with the stream, it has to do with the slope, vegetation, and so forth that we've discussed. And so I'm not thinking the entire piece of property, but I guess I would have a real hard time denying them that use based upon the merits that we've talked about.
How big is Garden Ridge, Gary? What'd you guess?
I guess you could go scale that one. That might be reasonably close. Garden Ridge, this one right here looks like a cross.
Keep in mind, the major road plan is to extend Snyder Road all the way over to Hatmaker, which is at the base of Fretz Road, and that's gonna
15.2,
be
that's
your major
15.2 acres.
corridor.
15.
It's still a little larger.
Subdivide that.
About half the size of that.
Maybe just the road.
How this reads in the subregs, it says, "The planning commission shall not approve land unsuitable for subdivision due to flooding, bad drainage, steep slopes, rock formation, or other features likely to be harmful to safety, health, and general welfare of future residents unless adequate methods are formulated by the developer for meeting the problems created by the subdivision of such land."
Yeah, you're on JCPenney there.
That's pennies.
Yeah, that's
That's
Penny,
11.
the one you just clicked on.
So pennies is 11.
That's kind of giving you pennies.
This whole thing.
Is that Gator Mountain?
Mm-hmm.
No, Gander Mountain will be one more parcel to the east, the one that backs up to the interstate. Yep, that's
Yeah,
it.
that one.
That's probably pretty close. 809.
That's pretty close.
I guess the question that you want to ask yourselves with regards to a big box, with what Gary referenced before with the vacant, underutilized commercial properties that we currently have. And that's part of the question that's before you.
You know, something else, and I know it's a long ways down the road, obviously, I mean, it may not be in my lifetime, but when Campbell Station Road is moved, I think the attractiveness of that piece of property from a commercial standpoint, I think it goes down because it's not gonna be as visible. And that's when I look at that, I think in the long run, that what Gary's proposal is, again, I'm not 100% against commercial, but you know, trying to look down the roadways, I think it's going to be much more attractive from a residential standpoint with that. You know, it's going to give that piece of property a little bit more privacy and tranquility to a certain extent. Now that's a ways off, but it is something just to keep in mind because it's not going to be on a major road as it is today. You know, I don't know how many years that is, if it's 15, 20, or 50, but it is going to change the whole look of the front piece of that property.
If you're looking at the hotel property adjacent to it, that's 6 acres.
But again, I don't think it's an all or nothing. I don't think you have to go commercial on that whole 9 acres. You only, if they have a vision of some shops right at the front that would service multifamily, higher density housing behind that, and then what's there, basically the wooded area being open space, and maybe they do something else with it. I think that's a win-win for everybody. And I think that, I mean, there might be some local, you know, it's got easy access to the interstate. That's going to be attractive for a lot of people that are going to not want to have large lots. They may want to have some. I mean, there's all kinds of ideas and thoughts that could go in there to mix. It's kind of a win-win, I think, for the town and the property.
Yeah, I mean, I think
all I'm saying is not an all or nothing. All
Right.
residential, all commercial.
Have we ever created, Knox County has what's called a neighborhood commercial, which has, the maximum footprint of a single building can be 5,000 square feet. And I mean, have we ever created, I know we have the downtown district and we have some areas on the growth plan, like for instance, down at the roundabout at McPhee. But have we ever thought about a district that, which kind of like what Ed's saying, maybe big box stores aren't the most appropriate there, but having some sort of smaller retail with a transition as you go through the retail, going from retail to maybe higher density residential to lower density residential. And we may only be talking 9 acres of what's really usable, depending on how much expense that they or subsequent owners would want to go through to try to deal with the slopes and get over to the other side.
I'll address the last thing you said first and then go back to
Okay.
neighborhood commercial. It's not just about whether someone wants to go to the expense of developing it. It's whether we feel it is appropriate, given the environmentally sensitive nature of that area, knowing that all drains into sinkholes and everything, as to whether it is appropriate. So that's, a question. The other one is, I had an entire neighborhood commercial district written. It went down to Blaze of Glory. Ed might remember that one. Because it was definitely before Ron and Rita were on the planning commission. But yes, we had a neighborhood commercial district, zoning district written up. You two might have been on the commission when that was done. But Blaze of Glory. But always back in my mind that it's a good idea to have one.
Didn't mean it was a bad idea.
Well, it may be like, we've talked about like the McPhee roundabout. We thought that might be a good area in the growth plan, looking at some sort of small neighborhood type commercial or
like a local
Yes.
local
very,
commercial.
very, local
I've
convenience.
I've always been a fan of it. It's just that, wasn't ripe at the time I came
Right.
up with it. apparently.
Well, you also have Snyder Road in there to consider and what may eventually develop down through there, don't you?
You got all outlets.
Yeah, the long-term goal is Snyder Road will be extended to Hatmaker. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with where Hatmaker is, but when Fretz Road comes down, it's basically it's the parallel to Grigsby Chapel, the interstate, that kind of. It's off to the west of those.
Basically go past the storage units and just keep on going.
Go to the west, Gary.
Mm-hmm.
From where those little blue buildings are, it goes to the west, and then the road runs parallel to the interstate. It would run across that property through there and onto Where the town limits kind of goes, jigs back towards the interstate, that's where Hatmaker is. No, you went to, you had it on there, right? Yeah. Keep going to the left.
Stubs right there.
Yes, currently that's where it stubs, but the major road plan has it going across the property. Gary just panned across the property is currently on. And then Fretz Road is that road that's perpendicular to the interstate right there. And,
There's a major road plan.
yes, that's it, right there. And so you do have to look at what that corridor means into the long-term scheme of things. I think Ron was just mentioning that, actually.
Would the Wellens want to discuss maybe a potential neighborhood commercial zoning district? I mean, since you're not really under the gun trying to put together a project, but that might be a compromise that this board would support. And there obviously a lot of investigation to understand kind of what it's about, because we don't have it today. Knox County has one, and probably Ruth still has it on her computer anywhere, the one that she started working on some years ago. But this might be a good candidate for that, which would be kind of what you're talking about. Ice cream stores, the shoe store, smaller type commercial. You could have more separate buildings, but it would preclude you from having a big box store.
Sure. My husband has said,
Ageless community.
Maybe.
my husband has said most immediately, you know, he said on that back, while still trying to preserve the trails that we would need, or just nature in general, work around the sinkholes and all that, because when we were first dating 35 years ago, a long time, he just loved to walk up and down all those back slopes, as you say. But anyway, the most immediate need, he said, would certainly be some fill dirt back there. But then he also said, now come on, Kay, those people in the little hotels there, they'd want to walk across and get some ice cream again, and have some kind of combination is what he thinks might work well.
That's kind of what we're talking, maybe a combination. Of maybe some, it could higher density residential or multifamily, or even lower density residential if that's what you so desire, and then maybe some smaller commercial that would just dictate smaller footprint commercials. It would be more strip mall style commercial versus big grocery store commercial.
Again, Gary,
When we look at these, I often think about, if this were my property, what would I do? And from the beginning, this for me was planned development, just because of the different types of uses you could put in there. I don't know if it would qualify for planned development, if it's got the frontage or not, but I think everybody's got the right idea to have a kind of a collage of uses in there that would just be harmonious with everything else. It's just a very tough piece of property with great access.
well, Gary, do we need, for their purposes of selling the property, maybe, or do we have to do something right now? Can we keep the things the way they are until something happens?
Well, I think their intent would be to market it to a commercial developer.
So.
Is that right? Yeah. Right. With this process, and I know you all understand this, but I got to say it so I can hear it coming out of my mouth. You got to remember that with this commercial, we can't designate a commercial and then craft it. We designate a commercial and we walk away. They could sell it to a gas station owner or developer, and boom, we've got that. I mean, there's great ideas for this property, but the reality is we can do only so much and then let it go. So, yeah.
That's kind of why I brought up maybe that neighborhood commercial.
For the record, neighborhood commercial, generally speaking, includes gas stations, just so you know.
Does it include gas stations?
Yeah.
I I mean, the gas
I mean,
station.
we don't have to include it, but
That'd be charging station.
generally speaking, it is
Right, maybe
because,
charging station.
Like if
you know,
I-
it's a convenience mart is often what you see with a neighborhood commercial is a convenience mart. Neighborhood commercial doesn't include shoe stores.
Well, you're right. You think of the gas station on the
You think about
down
like
at Choteau Road. That
Getty's
was
View.
under that neighborhood commercial.
Getty's.
The one that's right outside the. Go ahead, Ed. Ed's got it.
I'm just saying, you know, around Getty's View, that area.
Yeah,
that's
same
kinda
thing.
really
Gas
small.
station. You're exactly right. And maybe that's not part of the vision of this, but it seems like that.
Generally speaking, when you're thinking of a neighborhood commercial, if you're going to going to central place theory kind of thing, that what you're really looking at is your basic needs, milk, bread,
Yeah.
Stuff people are gonna jump in the car, run and get and come back.
right.
Maybe even better, they might even ride their bike.
It's kinda like,
That's the idea behind
The
it.
idea.
Is to reduce the trips.
You know, walk over. You know,
Yeah.
I'll use Weigels as an example. If you ever had one of those little milkshakes in there, they're good. You know, go in there, pick one up. You know, so just keep that in mind that traditionally when you talk about neighborhood commercial, that's the level of service that you're looking at because that's, it's a quick convenience kind of thing.
Okay.
For this, just one more thing, for this process, we wouldn't need to really talk about zoning districts. You know, if you're leaning towards a commercial component, then we would just need to designate that and amend the land use plan. Then, the Wellens would have to come back and apply for the rezoning, and we could work on it then. If that's the way you're leaning.
So for right now, you'll be back next month, or is that
We'll be back every month
every
until,
month?
until we make a decision. Give me some direction. Do you want me to come back with a couple different alternatives?
What zone do we have in the growth plan that would most match a neighborhood commercial? I hate to, well, I don't want to use the term zone, but what designation do we have on our, our land use plan?
Here, I'll bring it up right now. You have commercial. You have it goes from mixed use to commercial to regional commercial, so you would just designate it as commercial.
mixed use is kind of,
Run back up to mixed use for a
Yeah.
second.
it's kind of the,
The reason being is I saw like right in the middle, small niche retail stores.
right.
Small footprint versions of chain stores, convenience stores, small groceries, coffee shops, bakeries, personal service offices, and modest residential.
Yeah.
Mixed use to me is that mixed use does preclude the big box stores. Now, the gas station thing we haven't really discussed, that being convenience stores are in there, but mixed use might be the right designation.
I want to give my sales pitch on the mixed use thing. As you all know, I'm a big fan of it from the standpoint of all the work that we put into creating the downtown district and everything, or the town center district. But Farragut is what it is, and I think we ought to be proud of what it is. And Melissa kind of brought this to my attention that when she talked to friends of hers and everything, that people moved out here because they liked what Farragut is. We like suburbia, and there's nothing wrong with being suburbia. But all of us, through the land use plan process, has expressed a need that we would like to see a downtown, which by definition is a mixed use area. If you dilute that demand, you will not be successful in any area, because the fact is that everybody that has moved out here or lives here or moved here to begin with is because they still like suburbia. And there is going to be a very limited demand on mixed use within the town of Farragut. And so you have to keep it geographically concentrated in order for it to be successful. Because if you dilute that concept, you will get a lot of underperforming, trying to think of the correct term to use, underperforming areas, none of which will be very successful. Whereas if you keep them concentrated in a particular area, which we've all designated, the areas around here as our mixed-use area, concentrating it makes the likelihood of it happening and being successful much greater. And that is my concern as your planner, and also as a resident of the town of Farragut, of diluting the mixed-use concept. Just as an aside, the staff has been, looking at priorities for walking trails and pedestrian connections. And the ones that didn't necessarily rise to the surface, but the ones that we were concentrating on, like, it was all, leisure service staff, engineering staff, Mark and I and Gary, is that connecting residential areas to activity nodes, whether it be the park, whether it be to a Weigel's or, a drugstore or something, but to some kind of, activity center that would make it easier. But the fact is, most people still don't want it in their backyard. That's why they moved here to begin with. So that is, I'll get off my soapbox, but as your planner, that is my concern with diluting the whole mixed-use concept within the town. That we do have some opportunities before us, but we want to make sure that we put them in the area that we want them to be, because there isn't going to be that great of demand.
To read between the lines, what I'm hearing is that you think that probably mixed use would not be appropriate on the designation on the land use plan here.
In this area, yes.
At this property, okay.
And part of the reason is that's, it's more of a regional commercial area in that
I
respect.
agree.
But one of the things that, it goes back to with serving the residential component, there's also already a lot of area that's in that right there, that zone commercial, that can serve that commercial need. And what you're really needing is residential and people to use it, to create the demand for the commercial.
I think apartments, multifamily would work very well there. That would be, second would be the commercial. And, looking at this, we have commercial, which would be your neighborhood to almost regional commercial. Then you have regional commercial. We could always create a local commercial future land use designation and come back and amend it that way if that's what you're leaning toward. So I don't want you to limit, I don't want it to be limited to what we're seeing right here. We can change it to wherever we want.
I guess my concern is I just didn't want to mislead the Wellens with a commercial designation, being that maybe big box commercial is kind of not what we're thinking is most appropriate.
I agree. If you're gonna change this designation to a commercial, you need to be very specific.
Well, that's kind of what my thought was. I felt if we're forced to pick one of these out of our recipe here. And again, I want to be just as absolutely transparent as possible.
I recommend, if you have not done so already, drive up the road through there. And I think what Gary said, that he thinks that apartments would be an excellent use in that area, because you are transitioning with the hotels to higher density residential, to the mobile home, to single family residential, up through that area. And before Ms. Wellham's mother passed away, I was dealing with developer types that were dealing with her mother. And they are all looking at that area for apartments. I don't think in the 6 years that I have talked to folks, or it might even be longer than that, I don't know how long, has it been longer than that? Okay, time flies when you're having fun. It has always been higher density residential that have been looking at that property. So in that respect, in fact, the most recent folks that I dealt with just within the last few months has been higher density residential, has looked at that property. And I was told that they have to get a certain number of units per acre or gross area for the development to be successful. And that's why when we met with them, we talked about, maybe it's time to amend our open space cluster districts to include R2 and possibly even R3 as a base zone.
Well, we will see you next month then.
I'll come back with some options.
Okay.
We'll play it out.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have a public hearing on proposed location of new utilities.
There are none.
And do you want to adjourn the meeting and then go into the training? So the May 16th, 2013 meeting of the Farragut Municipal Planning Commission is adjourned. And do you want us in the audience?
Thank you. Mark's
You wanna
doing
take
it.
a break?
Yeah, let's take a little bit. Some of us need to move around.
Right ahead.
Mark's canceled all his plans.
Oh, that's.
This is a presentation that even if you're getting on the planning commission, might be good information to listen.
Test out.
I'm gonna run upstairs and get your.
It can't be recycled.
Is it raining?
No. Remember how you got the umbrella last
Oh,
year?
yeah.
I forgot.
Oh, I forgot that. I needed
I
that.
forgot Melissa's umbrella. So I'm gonna go
I
upstairs
forgot
and
it
Mark-
originally. So what am I gonna learn about this tree thing?
When conversation they rerouted, what happens to the existing cameras? Does it go
You
away?
might.
I have got to.
Yeah, they'll shut it.
Sure.
Then how would you get to this?
To make this easy.
It'll go over, and then Schneider Road will come over and you'll be able to.
I can't read the picture.
Schneider Road will be exposed.
So how do you access all
I
of
know, I know. I should have taken you up to Mooresburg.
They would look and say,
To Mooresburg, to my mother's farm up there.
it's not been
Mooresburg,
funded.
that's where my, you know, I talked about, it's, well, it's outside of Morris.
You'll be able to get to it, but it'll, it's gonna be
Mooresburg,
dangerous.
Mooresburg, yeah. Are you still going up that way? Oh, wow. Well, sometime when you, want to just take a drive, you'll have to check out Mooresburg. It's Bean you know where Bean Station is? But you go, I don't know my north and south from there. But you go out to the lake, cross over the bridge, head to Bean Station, take a right on 11E, 11W. I live there.
It'll be a whole new interchange.
Yeah, and it started out with 200 acres, and I've sold 2/3 of it.
It's mostly the state.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was good.
We'll get a
It was
little
good.
input on it.
I mean, I didn't get the millions of dollars I was hoping, but
The design actually. they
it's
call
all
it
agricultural.
sometime
And
it's
Hawkins
really-
County, I don't know how much zoning they have and do. No.
It's gonna be many.
Dan
It's
Hawk and I
rolling.
talked about that, so.
I do have to see what she's saying about
It's a full agricultural.
There really is.
You can, I won't take offense.
small
But there's
coffee shop for those people. Those
Yes.
We said, go ahead and
right,
leave.
to walk
I
to
would.
conveniently.
I mean,
Are you
Unless you just want to learn about tree topping, it's an exciting topic.
so,
Much that I can.
That's
see.
I'll look for it in the Farragut Press.
Yeah, okay, I do the same.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.
Goodbye, see
Good
ya.
luck.
Yep.
Where the Dunkin' Donuts is, there's a couple vacant structures, but for the most part, that whole area seems to be thriving. They just built Einstein's, they built a yogurt place, and all that's doing really well, so,
It gets so much traffic.
I've driven by there, I can't walk.
yeah, it gets great traffic. I don't know, I'm not sure what my opinion is about this one. Oh, I hate tree topping.
She is right about.
What they did to those beautiful trees there by Shiloh,
I don't know if they're.
I've got some
occupancies
pictures
over
on
there.
that.
How long
that
you
was a
got for us,
crime.
Mark? Are you a 30-minute guy tonight?
Spaces.
Yeah.
My landscape
won't
guy
be
calls it crepe murders
Unless
instead of
y'all
crepe
want
myrtles.
You
He
can do
goes,
20.
you don't have to
if
cut them
need.
down
You
like
can do
that. He
20.
goes, you really don't.
I'll try to
Well, I
keep
feel her pain because, I feel her pain because I've been in a similar situation. There's a hill
room and I'm looking at these
that
beautiful trees
looks
and
like
I'm like,
it'd be a great place to build houses,
pretty,
but
and
it's
you go down the
just,
first floor, I'm like, these are the biggest crepe myrtles I have ever seen in my life.
yeah.
They don't cut them back.
Butchered like
You
they
don't
are.
crepe murders. You don't have to do that.
Yeah.
They're done,
That's true.
Is that what those trees are along?
about
What
it.
is the name of that road there by Shiloh and
No, those are Bradford pears.
they are?
Although they have
all
some
that. The
crepe
person
myrtles
that bought,
interior to that.
the,
Bradford pears
well, there was one piece,
fall over really.
Yeah, there was one of the worst.
5 acres and a
That's
different
one of the reasons I
location to the
top
road, and then there's
said
another
we quit
60 acres when all
that
those
way.
houses.
So,
And the house been sitting there
I mean,
vacant.
really, the problem is you shouldn't plant them in the first
While she
place.
was alive,
Now,
she didn't want
now that
anybody
we
in
know
it.
about them,
So we didn't
Well, it's
lease
like
it.
willows. Don't willows get into the
We
pipes
had
in
some
the
other,
ground?
Willows
had
are pretty
another
brittle.
house up
Yeah.
there
generally any tree
that
that
I
grows
leased
fast is
several
gonna be
years
brittle.
ago. God,
It's
it
just
was
About
gonna be
willows.
brittle.
oh,
Not
that
too
would have been
bad.
great.
They're pretty
You
tough
know,
growing.
but
But
it had a
they're
little
not
hill
quite as bad as some of the others.
right next door to it.
I'll get started here as soon as they're ready.
My neck. See.
Guy said, so-and-so's beating up his old lady out there, you need to come out and do something about it. Yes. I'll go on a little break.
Yeah, I know it.
All I do is
Well.
collect the rent. If you don't like
I will stay closer to 30 minutes rather than 2 hours, so I will. Because Ron would be upset with me.
That's right, that's right. I'm holding you to it, baby.
Okay. All right. Let me get started.
Yeah, go ahead. Mark is going to go ahead and get started now.
Okay, I'm gonna
Going to go ahead and get started.
get started here. This is a little bit outside of your all's normal scope of review, I guess, but as you know, with the state law that you're required to get so many hours of training per year. Hopefully this will qualify. I don't know if I'm an adequate presenter or not, but we'll give it a shot. This is a presentation that I gave to the Visual Resources Review Board a couple of months ago. We've been having some real problems and it's not just in Farragut, it's everywhere with the practice of tree topping. So what I want to do is just kind of inform you all to, what this practice is, why do people do it, why is it a bad idea, and what can we maybe try to do to lessen its frequency in the town. So with that being said, I'm going to try to stay as close to 30 minutes or Ron's going to be mad at me, so I'm going to try to keep it. It won't be 2 hours, I promise. Just a quick definition of tree topping. It's basically when somebody gives a tree a haircut. That is a good way to phrase it. Yeah. It's you basically just go in without any consideration for the tree shape or growth pattern. You just do this number, typically. You don't select out anything. There's no thought to it generally. You just give the tree a haircut. And some examples. Some tree topping is not as severe looking as others. This is tree topping. You can see all those branches were cut in a uniform pattern. That's classic tree topping. Here's another example. And I don't know why these trees were topped. These are ginkgo trees. I could understand somewhat with Bradford pears, and we'll get to that in a minute. But ginkgo trees, I don't know. Bradford pears, these trees should have never been planted there, obviously. Here's another classic example of tree topping. And feel free to interrupt if you have any questions or commentary when I'm going through this. This is another tree that's frequently topped, and that's crepe myrtle. We've actually moved crepe myrtle out of our recommended tree list to the large shrub consideration because we don't want people to plant crepe myrtles to satisfy the understory allowances that the ordinance provides for in parking lots, and then come in and we find out 2 years after they planted them, they've all come in and topped all the crepe myrtles, because the idea of the tree being in the parking lot is to give the parking lot shade and beauty, and you can see that when a tree is topped, it never really grows back to look normal again. You really almost can't reverse the damage. You can see where the new growth is on that crepe myrtle. Why is it so common, this tree topping practice? A lot of people think that, and there is some validity to some of this, promoting safety. That could be somewhat valid with Bradford pears because they're very weak-wooded and they have a very poor form. And if you don't lessen the weight on those branches, sometimes you can, fall over on your car out in the parking lot. So some people think that it stimulates growth. I hear that oftentimes with crepe myrtles. I've had to get on a couple of banks here in town. It's like, why did you do that? Well, it makes them flower better next year, and it doesn't. And it's created a tree that will never, as I mentioned earlier, look the same again and look natural. Some people do it to improve visibility of a business. Some people think it just looks better to round off a tree, give it a nice little haircut. people oftentimes go with the philosophy of, well, it's just easier to come out and top the tree than actually pay somebody that really knows how to prune a tree to come in and properly prune it. And we'll kind of debunk all of these reasons here shortly. What are the problems that tree topping can create? And I think a lot of tree topping occurs just out of, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but just out of ignorance. People don't really realize what they're doing to the tree. They're actually making the tree, in most cases, more unsafe than safe, because the new growth that comes out on the trees, and we'll see some pictures of this in a minute, is they're coming, it's these little water shoots or suckers that come in off the end of the stubs of the trees that have been topped, and that new growth is inherently much more weak than if the tree hadn't been topped in the first place. It also makes trees more susceptible to insects, pathogens, sun scald, all kinds of problems, because if you cut a tree at an improper location, it's much more likely to have all of these conditions come about, as opposed to doing proper pruning. We'll show some examples of that here in a minute. And you also, when you're pruning the tree, you're not going underground and pruning the roots. So what you're doing is you're creating an imbalance between the above versus below portions of the tree. And that creates a lot of stress on the tree's ability to produce energy. And that actually makes the tree less likely to grow well. You know, one of the reasons that people top trees, oftentimes they think it makes it grow better and quicker, and actually inhibits growth. Tree topping actually inhibits visibility. People that go out and top trees to try to improve their business's visibility, they're really creating a long-term, more obscure frontage, because this new growth is far more dense and more obstructive than if they were just to go in and selectively thin the canopy of the tree. And tree topping in the long run is actually more expensive to the owner and certainly to the community. Trees that are topped, as I said earlier, they never look the same. They just look like a disfigured thing that's sitting out there. And oftentimes, because of the problems that topping creates, the owner has to come in and remove and replace the trees because they've died. Then also, topping creates a continual maintenance program, because you have to come back and top the trees again and again and again. Whereas if you just hired somebody to actually come out and prune it properly, you actually would end up saving money in the long run. So, most trees, and this is, most of these are in the town actually, and you could find this anywhere, but you can see where the tree, I don't know if this is going to work or not. Let's see. Yeah, maybe it won't. It's not. It was working earlier. Yeah, it was. Okay. Well, I think you all can see. You can see where the old and, where the tree was topped. All these examples, now these are all Bradford pears, and that's by far the most commonly topped tree. Some of it is somewhat valid because of the weight. Here's those little water shoots or suckers that come in on the ends of the stubs, and as those grow, they're very weak, even for a Bradford pear, which is really a problem. And it just looks, really bad. Some other examples. Here's some of that dense. It could be anybody's neighborhood. My neighborhood's got some of this stuff in it. This is an example of how dense some of this new growth can be. So somebody, a business person goes out and they want to, let's just top the tree so we can enhance their visibility. But if the new growth that comes back looks like that, you've actually made it harder to see the business. So why should we be concerned about tree topping? It affects our community's aesthetics. That's obvious. It actually makes trees more dangerous. It compromises the purpose of the town having landscaping requirements in the first place. And it creates an expense sometimes that even taxpayers end up having to pay for. This is, often the case with utility-related topping, and that trees die as a result of excessive topping, and utility customers oftentimes have to pay for that. So what are the alternatives? And I'm not going to get super technical on any of this stuff. Really, the first thing to do is to plant the right tree for the right location. Oftentimes topping occurs because somebody planted the wrong tree in the wrong spot, and we'll see some examples of that here in a minute. If you have a tree like a Bradford pear that's just inherently weak, there's other trees like that, Paulownia, some maples, some willows. Generally any tree that grows real fast is going to be inherently weak-wooded. So be on the lookout if you buy a tree from somebody and they say, well, this thing will be 30 feet in 2 years. You got to be careful about that.
Mark, is that why when we first moved here, which was 20+ years ago, everybody was planting
Yeah.
Bradford pears? Is that why they were doing it?
Yeah. Well, we didn't know. I don't think they knew the problems that the Bradford pears have. And right now I'm working with a lot of property owners and shopping center owners to come up with some phasing out of their Bradford pears. We're going to try to hopefully work with them on having the Bradford pears removed and then replacing those Bradford pears with true parking lot shade trees. They would only be like the 2-inch caliper because we don't want an undue expense for the but in the long run they're going to have a more attractive center. They're going to have less maintenance and less long-term costs and those kinds of things. And so far I've had pretty good reception from a number of entities. Not so good reception from a couple, but that's the way it goes. Yeah, that's one that I'm working with.
A lot of trees in there, and now it's just kind of barren because of the absence of some Bradford pears and some still
Yeah.
there. And I'm
Yeah.
just trying to think of maybe a program to help stimulate some of the older shopping centers that were utilizing the Bradford pears. That say, hey, if you'll tear it down, we'll supply you the tree. The expense is really getting the tree out of there.
Yeah, that is a big expense, especially if you have to
It's a lot
grind
more
the
than
stump
what
down.
a new tree costs. If you want
Yeah.
to put it
Oh,
in,
yeah. A whole lot more.
Shoemark oak that we've been using that you like.
Yep.
2-inch, it's $100 tree.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. We haven't really gotten that in depth.
Some of those ones where we're having trouble trying to get those trees exchanged.
Yeah, because a lot of the older centers, Ingalls, when they redid Ingalls, they took out all their Bradford pears, and most of that is willow oaks now. And Village Green's been very receptive to the idea, and I think they're going to work with me on that. And there's a couple other places, Hardy's, the smaller scale stuff, and really I kind of approach it as this actually is good. I know it's an expense, and I understand that, but in the long run, it's going to benefit you. You're going to have a more attractive shopping center. You're going to have less maintenance, and an attractive, inviting center is good for business. It's going to encourage more people to want to come in there, want to shop there. That's one of the reasons why Turkey Creek does well, I think, is it's very well landscaped for what it is. So if I'm kind of approaching it in that regard. I'm not out trying to impose some regulations on somebody or be heavy-handed, certainly not. I'm just trying to look at it, what can we do working together to make your center and the town, it can't give us both a win-win, Another thing that needs to be done is to encourage local landscapers to learn more about how to properly prune trees instead of just kind of adopting a quick and easy approach. There's a real problem with that. You know, again, planting the right tree in the right location. This is at Shiloh. That tree should never have been there. These trees, Bradford pears and Bricksworth, right under the power lines, they're just inviting topping when you do that. The Bradford pear, I've already talked about that. When you prune a tree, if you do it properly, you won't even know it's ever been touched. That's the beauty of it. Even on the lower right-hand slide there, where you had a huge tree that's bisected by an overhead power line, they've pruned that tree, and they kept its natural canopy, its natural shape. Well, that's an incredible job right there. I'd love to get the local utility folks to do something like that more often. That would be great. But it's difficult, and it takes a lot of time and patience and skill, and I understand where they're coming from. That's more cost for their customers and so forth. But that's really a good example. But all these trees here have been pruned, and they just look like a normal tree that you'd see out in the field. Proper pruning, and again, I'm not going to get into this technical stuff, but generally you do it on most trees. You're going to you want to leave what's called the branch collar, and we'll see this in a minute. Leave that intact. You want to cut just below the branch bark, and that kind of determines where you make the cut. Typically you do a 3-cut method to keep the limb that you're cutting off. You want to cut it in 3 sections, or 2 initially, so that when it does break, it's not causing a lot of scarring on the bark of the tree. This is a diagram of like a limb coming into the main trunk, and where you would apply a proper prune. You would go just below this, what's called the branch bark ridge. It's just cell growth where the trunk and the lateral come together, and that just grows every year. You'll see it when you look at a tree. It's kind of oftentimes it's a ridgey looking, and then you got the branch collar on the lower part of the branch where it comes into the trunk, and you want to just cut it at an angle like that, leaving that branch collar intact, starting at the edge of the branch bark ridge, and that's generally how you do a prune on an individual basis. If you're looking at the how to prune a tree just holistically, first thing you want to do is, are there any dead or dying branches? Go ahead and prune those out, just like I showed on the previous slide with the 3-cut method or 2-cut method if it's already dead. You want to try to always keep that central leader, because that's essential to keeping the tree's natural shape. And then you want to just go through this. This is where it takes some skill, and I'm not skilled enough to do pruning on a lot of trees myself. I'm not an arborist, but you would want to get an arborist if you had a really complicated tree, and they would kind of go through, and they would know which branches are less productive and not really essential for the tree, that they could thin it out. But the idea is to not top it like I showed earlier, with it's just a uniform, shearing. That you basically actually go back, you select entire branches within the tree, and you go back to the trunk and do the proper cut, leaving that branch collar intact, and that's the way you thin it down, and the end result is a thinned out tree, but it still has the main shape of a tree. And you can do this to a crepe myrtle. It takes a lot more, it takes a lot of skill to do it to a crepe myrtle. Is you have to use there's some subjectivity there. You just have to basically look at it holistically, kind of get a picture for what you think can be taken out, and the end result is the tree still maintains its basic shape. These are other examples. You pick out the low-hanging fruit first. Remove sucker growth. Remove anything that's dead or dying, that's obviously dying on the tree. get those first, and then if you've got some other stuff left that you want to try to still thin it out a little bit, then that's where it gets a little trickier, and you have to kind of look at, are there some limbs that removing them really doesn't detract from the shape and the function of that tree. You can do this you can lower the whole height of a tree and still keep its basic form, and this crown reduction is that practice. And here you can see the dash lines was the original tree canopy. You've cut it all back down with proper cuts so that the tree doesn't have that sheared look, but it has still a natural look to it. And by cutting the tree back to the branch collar, leaving the branch collars intact, the wounds that are created, because you're going to create wounds when you even properly prune a tree, but the wounds are much more likely to heal if you do leave that branch collar intact.